Hello, my name's Andy and today we're doing something a little bit different and looking at some tips that hopefully will bring you fantasy football dominance. It's going to be a bit different to my usual videos because for any of you that have been subscribed for a while, you know that I generally stream these days. But as I'm away this week, I wanted to prepare a video in advance to put out there just so that we had some content going out for you. So from next week we should be back to the normal streams, but in this one I'm going to take a look at some top tips for Fantasy Premier League. I'm going to start off with what I've called the usual. These are things that generally most managers know by now. They're not really worth discussing, but I've added them in there anyway. And you know, if you've been around the block a bit with FPL, then they're probably going to mean nothing to you. But if you're new around here, take a look at some of the things that you should definitely be doing week in, week out. So we'll start off with safe captains. Captain can really turn a poor week into an okay one and a good week into a great one. So I generally play safe with captain and go with one of your big hitters. Perhaps further down the line when we're getting a bit towards the end of the season, you might want to start looking for a differential. But generally I keep it safe. There's a reason the big hitters are the price they are, and they tend to deliver more often than not. Next one up is chips. Use them in the double game week, especially bench boost and triple captain. In fact, they're the primary ones that you'd wait until the double game week to use. They might work out in a single game week, but generally you should just play the odds and use them in a week that's got 2 fixtures. For the free hit chip, I think you're probably going to actually best off not using it in a double game week because you won't be able to combine it with the other chips. So I think this one's going to be best used in the blank game week. We'll have to see how it works out this season. It's the first time the chip's been around. But I think using it in a blank game week makes sense because it means you can plan your squad out for the weeks before and after it when the teams are playing as normal. And then in that blank game week, you just don't have to worry. You can completely change your team to have 11 starters. And then last kind of 2 chips are your wild cards. So you have one in each half of the season. So don't be afraid to use the first one early. A lot of people do that after kind of the first 4 to 6 game weeks. You can build team value, shift out any players that just aren't performing, and you're going to have a lot more info after 4 to 6 game weeks than you did pre-season. Obviously, pre-season's great hope, but not everything works out as you'd hoped from your game week 1 team. So don't worry about using your wildcard early. Don't feel like you have to use it, but there's generally no harm in using it early. So now we're going to go into the top 5 tips, or not necessarily tips, but things that I wanted to discuss. I've given them a number, but to be honest, they're not really in any particular order. You should take into account all of them and not just do kind of the top 3. So we're starting off with be flexible, and this is something that I think most managers think they are, but probably aren't, and that's myself included. You know, there's always that player or that tactic which you'll go against because of former prejudices. So, for example, last season Costa was absolutely killing it. Wasn't necessarily getting double-figure hauls week in, week out, but he was scoring points each week. And I've kind of got a bit of a thing against Costa, so I never brought him in. So I did okay in the end, but I think that was kind of damaging for a lot of the season for me and could have made a lot of money out of it. So yeah, people tend to use different reasoning for not using a certain tactic, not getting in a certain player. But I think being flexible is key. As another example, last year, 3-4-3, which is pretty much the most used formation, I'd say, in FPL, and tends to be the most popular for a good reason. It works out most of the time. But last year, a lot of people did really well with 3-5-2. And the ones that hooked onto that earlier, that started using 3-5-2 before the rest, did really well out of it. So I used it in the end, but I probably wasn't quick enough. I wasn't really flexible enough and thought that I wanted to keep trying 3-4-3. So I had Charlie Austin that was doing really well for me. And then all of a sudden he got injured, and I kept trying to get that third striker instead of going for a midfielder, which would have worked out much better because they were all kind of performing at that time. So I've already spoke about game week 1 earlier, but I think you need to realise that there's a reason that's one of the best parts of the season because there's so much hope. You've got this team which you think is going to be the one this year. The problem is that rarely happens, and for a lot of us, we're starting to try and get those green arrows right from the off because we've fallen so far behind. So I would say be flexible and be prepared to change your tactic and your personnel in your team as often and as quickly as you need to. So next up, we're looking at price rises and falls, and to be honest, I could have probably stuck with this in the usual part at the start of the video because everyone tends to give this as a tip, but I still wanted to talk about it a bit more. So I strongly advise using sites like Fantasy Football Fix and FPL Statistics. They'll show you when a player is likely to fall or rise in price. Now, for the first few weeks of the season, they don't tend to be that accurate because FPL tend to change the algorithms and change kind of what's needed for a player to rise or fall. But usually these sites have got it worked out after the first kind of 3 or 4 game weeks. And while they're not 100% accurate, they're pretty reliable. Now, I wouldn't say you should make transfers solely based on whether a player is rising or falling in price. Generally, you want to give yourself as long as possible to make the transfer. So you'll hear a lot of people say, if the game week starts on Saturday, you should wait until Friday to make your transfer. And I kind of agree with that because you want the most information available to you. But if it's a transfer you know you're going to do 100%, then you might as well just go ahead and do it and build a bit of squad value, which could help you out further in the season. There were times last year, I remember when I was going to bring in Lukaku for someone, and Lukaku didn't have a game, so he was only training. The chances of him getting injured were quite slim. So I could have just brought him in and kind of made myself 0.1, 0.2 million, but I waited and waited, and it really hurt my squad value. Now, that didn't matter in the end. I still had a good finish, but it could have maybe made things easier, and perhaps I could have had a higher rank if I concentrated that a bit more. So I would definitely keep a track of price rises and falls. It can really help. Everyone owns him is a pretty common saying within FPL, and it's basically to try and tell you that everybody else in the game owns a player and you shouldn't bring him in because of that, because he's not going to help you climb in rank. Now, I think there's 3 reasons why you should ignore this. First of all, not everybody owns him. No player has ever had 100% ownership. Number 2, there tends to be FPL community bubbles, so you kind of have the fantasy football scout bubble, you'll have FPL Twitter bubbles, and they kind of go together. They all kind of have the same player or list of players that they want to bring in. But as an example, last year we kept saying we all own Alonso. Everybody owns Alonso. He was hitting points in, week out, and people were saying you shouldn't bring him in because everyone already owns him. But actually, he was around 10% ownership for the whole game out of 4 million players. So he was still a really big differential. So what I'd say is check your mini leagues and see what kind of percentage of players you're playing against actually own someone, and don't be fooled when everyone in the community says they own him. And number 3, it's not necessarily a bad thing that everyone owns the same player. There will definitely been players last year that didn't have Alonso and did really well, but bringing him in just makes your life easier. If you've got a cheap defender that's scoring like he was, why not bring him in? There tends to be a good reason everyone owns them anyway, and you shouldn't let it put you off. While your climbing rank might be a bit slower because you've got a player that's highly owned that everyone else has, it also means your falls are a lot slower too, so it can kind of be a bit of a cushion. So everyone owns him, I would ignore it and play your own game, even if that means you're bringing in a player that everybody else apparently has. So calling a move boring or a transfer boring is another common term used in FPL communities, a bit like everyone owns him. You'll find that managers try and seek out a way to make, in their words, the game more fun by bringing in a player that generally no one else has, or who's a massive punt. They're probably not owned by many players, and for good reason, but they want to bring him in the hope that they get a big haul out of them. And to be honest, I can understand why. If you have a punt that massively pays off, it feels really good. You can brag about it a bit on Twitter, but generally it's probably unlikely to work out. You'll always find those managers that can make it work, you know, and every week they'll have a punt, and every week they'll have a good game week. But as a general rule, I'd say the boring move wins probably 8 or 9 times out of 10. And if someone calls your move boring, it's probably a good thing. It probably means it's going to work out. Don't be put off when someone says the move is boring, because generally I find when players say they want to make a move because it's more fun, they end up having not so much fun when they have a bad game week, and then they tend to complain about it. So the last part of the video we're going to talk about is hits. Hits, hits, hits. It's a pretty touchy subject, again, within the FPL community. You tend to find that players either love them or hate them, and then every now and again you get people like me that kind of like to take them when they feel it's going to work, but don't take them just for the sake of it. So I would say definitely avoid taking hits for the sake of it, or if you're in a rage because you had a bad week, just relax, take a seat back, check it again in a few days and see if you still want to make that that move that's going to take a hit. And basically a hit means you take -4 points to bring in an extra player that week. Now, I definitely wouldn't say write them off completely. I tend to look at them in like a long-term thing. So if you're taking a player out for a hit and replacing them with a very short-term move, and sometimes people will do that just for a week, it's unlikely to work out in most cases because you're basically already 4 points behind from the start, and you're gambling on the fact that the player you bring in will beat the player you took out by more than 4 points, basically. So it's very hard to do that on a week-to-week basis. But if you're replacing a player who's a real weak link in your team, and replace them with someone who's going to outscore them, or at least you think they're going to outscore them over the next 4 to 5 weeks, then I'd definitely go ahead and look at the hit. If you're thinking of it long term, say 4 to 5 weeks, then suddenly that points hits is 1 point a week over 4 weeks, and could work out. Now, a lot of the top managers don't take too many hits, but as an example, I took 96 points worth of hits last year and finished in the top 5k. Now, that's not to say if you take that many, you'll finish in the top 5k. Next year or this season, I might do the same and finish maybe top 100k. You just don't know. But I would say is hits can work, hits might not work. All I'm saying is don't let people put you off taking them if you think it's going to work out. So that's it for today's video. Cheers for tuning in. Hopefully it gave you some things to think about. I know some of the points in the video weren't strictly tips, but I suppose there were things that I wanted to just get off my chest and discuss, because the FPL community can be a bit of a daunting place sometimes. And I just wanted to say that you shouldn't be put off by the moves you want to make just because everyone else is doing it or because it's boring, because that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button. I'd really appreciate that. And if you're new around here, hit subscribe. That will let you know when my next video goes up, and maybe even more importantly, when I'm next going live with my streams that I do. During the FPL season, I try and do at least 2 streams a week where I just answer FPL questions from the chat. You can also follow me on Twitter at Andy85WSM, or on Facebook, which is Andy85WSMFPL. I'll try and notify you in advance of when I'm streaming, or at least I like to. And every now and again I talk FPL, and by every now and again I mean every day pretty much. Other than that, I'll see you next time, and thanks again for watching. I really do appreciate it.